Hi everyone. um, this weekend in Atlanta, if you're in the US, there's a tournament going on. It's the Warzone Atlanta tournament, and they just released the lists yesterday, and I got to sit down and just walk over them slightly. I'm not one of those people who makes huge spreadsheets of individual units and what is brought and all of that, but I I do try to go over what is the meta of a certain tournament because it informs me about different metas in different locations around the world, and that can be quite fun. I've also coming up on this channel. I have a video about a tournament in Poland as well, where I do the same thing. So for me, that looking through what is actually going on with different aspects of the game is quite fun. Now, Warzone Atlanta is it's a, from what I gather, it's a relaxed competitive tournament. So people are encouraged to behave nicely, to not be dicks, but it does allow for a lot of shenanigans in the list building department. So, what I wanted to see with this video was what do the Americans think that they should bring when that is allowed? So let's go and see what the meta of Warzone Atlanta is. Now, if we look at the event itself, it's as far as I can see, it's like 20-ish players. I got 19 lists, which is that sucks because that will mean the TO will have to play um, if it's 20 players. It's 1,000 points. They allow theaters and multi-platoons, including, I might add, the ultimate in cheesiness that you can mix a theater and a multi-platoon. A generic platoon. So you can have your theater platoon in one platoon and your generic platoon in the other. Um, that can really max out some cheese if you want to, because the limitations of your theater lists they are sort of nullified by the generic reinforced platoons. The only thing that would make this even more egregious is if they allowed tank platoons, but they don't. So, and there are restrictions on certain units, Gurkhas, Lancers, darker vehicles, and flamers. You can only have 2 of any of those. Um, so it sort of brings down the meta a little bit into some sort of normality where you don't necessarily see that many of these overpowered units. There is also a bonus on MMG teams, infantry-born MMG teams, and that is that you auto-pin whatever you're shooting at. So that has, and it did have an effect on many of the lists. I could see many people were bringing that because they were guaranteed a pin. Um, so that is nice to actually see those MMGs coming back onto the table. And there were some other minor changes to how the rules were made. I think having spoken recently with Marcus Vine of Warlord Games, that is how Warlord Games intends for their game to be played anyway, that the TOs sort of make decisions on anything that seems unclear, or because the game was not designed for competitive play, it wasn't really designed as a tournament game as such. Um, so the TO should like decide this is how we play that. Rex is a common theme that always gets brought up. What do you do with them? So that is the event itself. So what did people actually bring? Well, in terms of order dice, the range was from 11 to 20 order dice with a clear focus on the low end. The average was 13.7, which is sort of where I would expect it to be. But since we only have one true horde list of 20 order dice, that pulls it a little bit up. We have a sort of a split down the middle where we have a lot of order dice in the low end. In the 11 to 12 order dice range, we have 8 lists. That is a lot. And then we have 4 lists in the 13 to 14, where I would have expected most lists to be actually. And then we get a little slight rise in the end 15 to 17 order dice, we have 6 lists that are in that range. So for me, that was slightly odd to see this sort of inversed curve of the lists, um, and quite a lot of 11 or 12 order dice lists. That seemed to be the most normal list actually. So that was weird for me, seeing that. When we go to tournaments here in Denmark, you see maybe that 25% of the lists have that range band, and they are typically quite horrible. But the lists that I saw in the 12 and 11 order dice range were not that bad actually. They're not good, of course, because they're lacking in order dice, but the lists themselves were not all of them terrible. So there is something there that's different from the meta in Atlanta. Right, so that was the order dice. In terms of nations, we had 6 USA lists, and maybe that is to be expected that people playing in the US maybe want to bring Americans more than we see them being brought in Europe. Um, because we don't normally see that many American lists in competitive events in Europe. But this was the most normal list to be brought for this event. We saw 5 German lists. That is also pretty normal. There are always a lot of Germany aficionados who like the tanks, who like the spectacle of the German army and the range of choices that you get. Um, so it is pretty normal to have that many lists. German lists. Um, well, somebody's going to have to play the bad guys, aren't they? And then 3 Soviet lists and 2 British lists. Now, that was the biggest surprise for me because in Europe, at least, Soviets and Brits are definitely the top dogs at competitive tournaments. That is the most normal that we see. They are the ones who win tournaments. At the last tournament I was at, we had 2 British lists on number 1 and 2, and a Soviet list in third place. And all the top lists were basically, most of them were Soviet or British. So it was a little bit surprising that so few people have brought Soviet or British lists. But going through the lists themselves, you'll see my predictions at the end. I think that many of these might end up in top 5. Then we had 1 Australian, 1 French list, and 1 Japanese list. Each of these were also quite interesting and quite good, very cleverly thought out lists. Maybe especially the Japanese one, but the French one I also really liked. And well, the Australians are pretty tough. They have tough skirmish infantry and good selection of support choices. So nice lists. What selectors were used? We had 7 theatre platoons, and only 3 of them might be considered powerful selectors in themselves. Most of the selectors that were used were generic reinforced platoons. We had 12 of them who were purely generic reinforced. We had a few that had 1 theatre and 1 generic. And we had only 7 dual platoons. For me, that seems kind of low, but maybe that's because I've grown up in the Danish meta where we see at tournaments that allow multi-platoons, we see multi-platoons winning those tournaments all the time. The Danish Nationals last year, we had about half had brought dual platoons, and with the exception of 1 guy, they all entered in the top 50%. And about half had brought single platoons, and with the exception of 1 guy, they all entered in the bottom half. So for us, it seems like dual platooning is the way to go if you want to win. So that seems a little low to me. But we'll see what turns up in Atlanta. I'm hoping to get the results as well, so I'll go back and revisit this and see if there is something there that might be interesting and different. That dual platoons are not just overpowered compared to single platoons, or yeah, maybe the Americans are doing something different, right? And so those were the selectors, and of course, in the 3 powerful selectors, we had 2 CeeLo heights. One, the Japanese list had brought the War in Manchuria list, which I'll get back to because that's really interesting as well. So those were the only like really power selectors that I stumbled across. Um, yeah. What about the army builds? Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about with army builds, go and watch my video on army builds. Um, they are the sort of typical list types that I see in competitive environments. Now, for the Americans here, there was something unusual going on, and I'll get back to that in a little bit. But we did see the usual mixed bag lists. There were quite a lot of those. Um, and then something weird happened, and maybe it's because we had so many American armies being brought, so many American lists. There was quite a lot of skirmish lists. Um, we don't see that so much in Europe anymore. The skirmish lists, with a lot of decently sized infantry with rifles and BARs and a little bit of range maybe, um, that can sort of move back and forth on your own table half and just shoot at the enemy, deliver pins, deliver casualties. That is not something that we see that much of in Europe. But in America, they were as common as the mixed bag units. Um, so that was a surprise for me. We also saw uh, a lot more Death Star builds than I would have expected. Um, the Death Star build is when you have like single or maybe two units that are very, very expensive, very, very hard, um, and you build your list around those. And many, of course, of the low order dice builds were Death Star lists. There was a guy bringing a Panther. And there was a guy bringing several huge units of Fanatic SS, tooled out with assault rifles and SMGs and Panzerfaust and all of that. And that becomes very expensive, and it does mean that you have very little left for the rest of the army. So that is a Death Star build, and we had four Death Star units, four Death Star builds in this pack. And I did not expect that because typically we don't see Death Stars doing well in tournaments. The last tournament I was at was actually kind of an exception. We had one guy bringing in SU 152, doing okay-ish with it, but he is a strange case anyway. Normally we don't see Death Stars actually working. So I'm really interested in seeing what it does in this meta with a lot of fairly low order dice lists. There were also no true Soto tank lists, and this may be due to the pack, but with that pack, I could definitely build myself a Soto tank list. No problem at all. So I was immediately thinking, as soon as I saw the pack, well, I'll bring the universal carriers, I'll get myself two armored cars, I'll get myself two darker stewards, and I'm still good to go. Um, but nobody did that. Not a single one. We did have, however, some motorized lists. Um, so that is a difference here. We're seeing no true light armor spam lists, although we do see some lists that have, of course, double stewards or whatever. Um, and there were also a few lists that had broad Hanomag, but there were no universal carrier spams. And the motorized lists were, one of them was just everything more or less had a truck. The other one was a fairly funny one because it was sort of a soda tank list, but it was all soft skinned, with machine guns and darker. So so those two lists were not the usual setup for what I would expect. And then we had three assault builds, one of them being the Japanese cavalry one, the Manchuria, where all of the infantry was mounted. And if you don't know, then Japanese cavalry, they are fanatic, tough fighter, and have the range of cavalry. That combo is extremely powerful. Um, so allowing theater platoons allowed the players to bring this Japanese cavalry. And I think even fighting against Polish lancers, the Japanese cavalry is possibly the best cavalry of the game. But typically, people just disregard them because they're not actually being played because they're in one theater selector, right? So you don't see it that much. but I expect great things from this Japanese list, I think. Right, so those were the army builds. Now, my predictions for the top 5, and this is without knowing any of the players. This is just looking at the platoons and what's actually in them. I expect that these 5 lists will end up in the top 5, and of course, a lot may go wrong, and they might, face off against each other and just knock each other out. But these are the lists that I have. I always, when I go through like lists for a tournament, I rate them 1 to 5. These lists were the highest rated for me, and that is basically a rating of would I want to face this list. So the lowest is 1, which is I definitely will want to fight this one because that is an easy pushover. 2 is, well, it has some things, but I think still I could beat it. 3 is, okay, this is a good competition. We might have an interesting game. 4 is, ooh, this is a good list. And 5 is, I could not make this better. This is terrifying. So, and most of the lists for this tournament were between 2 and 4. So there were no true fiber lists here, although the 20 order dice one does come close, as does the Japanese cavalry platoon. So the first one that I wanted to bring out here is the 20 order dice, a British Indian platoon. That is, of course, a deadly combo because you get 2 units for free, a forward artillery observer and an infantry unit. And it was a mixed bag type of platoon. It had double platoons, dual platoons. It had a Gurkha unit and a Stuart in it. So there were a lot of good stuff in there, and there was a lot of other good stuff, support stuff as well. It had, of course, the lighthouses and all of that, engineers as well. Then we have the 14 Order Dice Australian. Again, a mixed bag, dual platoon. It had flamers and it had a Stuart. Was that a single or double Stuart? I can't remember. Anyways, so again, it's a sort of a combo of barbecue elements, of Stuart Darker elements, and of a lot of support elements for an infantry force that is a really good skirmish infantry force. Then we had the 14 Order Dice Japanese cavalry platoon, which that I expect great stuff from, because that Japanese cavalry is just so strong in assault, because they will hit very hard, they will fight very hard, and they will fight to the end, and they are tough fighters, veterans. So they are going to really mess up enemies. Or maybe they're regulars. I think they're actually regulars. Doesn't really matter. Tough fighter fanatic. The combo is there. Then we have 15 Order Dice Silo mixed bag with a Katusha and a Stuart. That as well was a really good list. And we, of course, always expect the Silo Heights list to do well. They typically do. And then we had the 13 Order Dice French motorized Daka. That was the list I was talking about, with a lot of soft-skinned elements and tough fighters. So so it had a lot of Senegalese. It had some cavalry. So again, a good close combat fighter with a lot of shooting. So that is a combo that I think will do well. So these are my predictions. Good luck to anyone going to Atlanta for the weekend, and good luck with the tournament. I hope that I get to view the results soon as well, and we'll see what goes on. Cheers.